Hey guys, my name is Cory Frederick, and I'm going to bring to you today the first episode of the Tyrant Network Podcast. In this podcast, or this first episode, I'm really just going to kind of summarize my life and kind of let you know how I got to where I am today. And one, it's a lot of times I'm talking to people at tournaments, and we always kind of get into some personal conversations, and they're just curious because they don't know me on a personal level or even on a professional level, besides just what they see at tournaments. And then two, quite honestly, I just think there's a lot of opportunity to relate with people out there, and a lot of us are very similar, and things that we've done or some of our interests and what our goals are and our upbringing and things like that. So first off, where I'm at today, and then I'll kind of get to there, is one, I am the founder and president of Tyrant Wrestling, Tyrant SportsGear, and CJF Group. I'm born and raised in Delaware. Actually went to a small school in Newcastle, Newcastle Baptist Academy through sixth grade. At that point in time, when I was in second grade, my dad passed away. I was only 7 years old. Didn't play any sports, or really probably never even knew about any sports up to that point, but I still remember the funeral director being at my house with my mom. I had no brothers or sisters, and the funeral director was meeting with my mother and basically said, "Hey, can I get your son involved in baseball?" So that was really my first introduction to organized sports. And unfortunately, it came at the loss of my father, but that kind of paved the road to where I'm at today. Middle school and high school, and this is really kind of where I started to get into wrestling. That's where most people know me as wrestling. I went to a school, Tower Hill, in Wilmington, Delaware, for seventh and eighth grade. And this school, you had to play a sport because they had no gym class. So every season, you had to play a sport. So I finally got an opportunity to play football. I started wrestling. And then, like I said, I've been playing baseball since I was 7 years old. So I played baseball, and then I actually ran a little bit of track. From there was no internet back then. So that was like 1991, 1992. And I remember going to the Delaware High School Wrestling State Championship at Dell State University and seeing really two teams win state titles and or individual state titles. One of them was William Penn, where my mom and my uncle actually attended high school, but the other one was St. Mark's High School, and it was a private Catholic school. So I remember seeing multiple guys win state championships from St. Mark's and just being like, man, I want to go there. I want to be a state champ. So I ended up transferring from Tower Hill as a middle schooler over to St. Mark's. And, that's once I got to St. Mark's, I did play freshman football. But then once I got into wrestling there, I was just so, excited, and it was just such a culture over there. And, kind of things changed for me. So I decided not to play baseball, and I did not continue with football. And then I just focused 100% on wrestling. Unfortunately, I was just never really overly interested in school itself. But I did go to school, one for sports. Two, because of the girls, and really, quite honestly, you had to go to school. Like, there was not even an option to drop out. So, but I went to school, didn't apply myself academically, unfortunately, at the time, but it was just different. Schools aren't set up for every type of learner. Really, they're set up for one type of learning, and it just didn't suit me. And so that's just kind of where I was at. Fast forward, just kind of like to my early adulthood, and some of the work that I had, but, I had moved out of my house in April of my senior year. It was actually 2 months before I graduated high school. And I rented a townhouse for a year with, which is now my wife, was my girlfriend at the time. Right after my high school senior wrestling season, so it would have been March timeframe, I started working at a company called MBNA America in part-time in telemarketing. And actually, a funny side note is I started working at MBNA before, or at the beginning of my senior high school season, and I remember them telling me they were going to be flexible with my schedule. Well, I went in there on a Thursday night after school and after practice, and I was cutting a lot of weight back then, and I was calling people to try to sell them a credit card, and I just remember saying to myself, "There's no way I can do this after all these workouts and not being able to eat or drink." And so I ended up resigning the first time around, but then I came back after my senior season, and and was able to continue working there. So when I graduated St. Mark's High School, I was working part-time at MBNA in the evenings in telemarketing. And I was working full-time at a company. Actually, one of my assistant coaches, Bill Valencia, had worked there at the time, but it was called Pocket Change of America. And I would work there during the day, and then I would get changed from my warehouse clothes into basically like a suit and tie. And then I would go over to my banker job in the evening. So after about 6 months of working full time I worked 6 months at Pocket Change, but then about 6 months later, after working part time at MBNA, I was able to get hired full time, which was great. We had just had my daughter and just some other things, and just kind of did that. So started in collections at MBNA, a credit card company, worked my way up. They were a great company to work for at the time. You didn't necessarily have to have a college degree. You just needed to have the performance and prove yourself and just do all the things you were supposed to do. So, I treated work like it was a sport, and every day I would go in and just, give it 110%, and got promoted quite a bit and worked my way up, until I left in 2009. At the time I was in management. So that's kind of the quick and skinny on the work. As an athlete, when I was wrestling, my wrestling background really is, I didn't even know about wrestling. It's different than nowadays where kids start so young, 4 or 5 years old. I had no history of wrestling in my family, and really only tried wrestling because of, you had to play a sport in middle school, right? But I remember going to an open mat club, and again, it was completely different back then. So it really wasn't organized. There was probably a half dozen kids there tops. But when I was in 6th grade, I went to a local wrestling club practice, and it was just kind of a show up, do your thing. Maybe they showed a couple moves, but for whatever reason, I didn't go back after trying it just one time. Then a year later, when I did it in school, I did it for 7th and 8th grade in middle school. And like I said, I headed over to St. Mark's. My freshman year, I ended up sliding into a spot at 152 pounds where really it was just kind of an open spot. So I got lucky because there was tons of talent above me and below me that had already been there, upperclassmen. But really, I ended up losing my wrestle off about halfway through the season to a senior. And this guy, he had put his time in. He was a pretty darn good wrestler, but he had lost a wrestle off at like 135, 140, 145, and he worked his way up. But 18 years old, and he was a fully mature man and had some more experience than me. So I ended up losing that wrestle off about halfway through my freshman year, which certainly hurt, but it was understandable. So then I just got the bug for wrestling, and I kept, I worked out in the off season. Again, no structured clubs back then. It was just all open wrestling mats. So there was a few of us, teammates that would just go to open mats, and we would just kind of do our own thing. And there wasn't a whole lot of off-season tournaments except for Mawas in my area in Delaware. So we'd go to practice a couple of days a week. We'd run our own practice kind of together, just a bunch of kids. And then we would hit the Mawa circuit, districts, regionals, and then eventually, I got the Eastern Nationals. But outside of that, there was little to no freestyle, at least that I knew of. Some of my guys went to Fargo, but I don't even think that I knew that they went back then. And then I would just train. So coming into my 10th grade year, I did pretty well. Again, I was 152 again. And then I got into some trouble. The week of the state qualifier, I did, something silly at school and got suspended from school for a day or two. And really, I probably would have been okay to wrestle, but I never even followed up on my head coach, which I should probably call him after I do this podcast. But I remember just being so embarrassed or just so upset with myself. I went straight home, and I was going to have like a 1-day suspension or whatever it was. But I ended up, getting pulled off the team because of that incident. And I think, while it could have been because of the incident, I think the bigger thing was because I was back in school. It really wasn't a big deal, on the academic side, on the school side. I think it was because I didn't go down to my coach and tell him what happened and, just look him in the eye and, let him know what transpired. I just went straight home and just kind of curled up in a ball. So for whatever the reason may be, he had pulled me from the team after wrestling varsity all year long. And I was, depending on the rankings at the time, I was a top 3 wrestler, if not a number 1 wrestler. But certainly there was a couple other good guys in that weight class that I'd wrestled later. But I learned a life lesson, I can tell you that. And it's here we are, 30 years later, and I still remember it and I still think about it. So fast forward my junior and senior year, I wrestled varsity both years, 152 pounds, and was a state finalist both years, and had previously beaten both the guys that I lost to in the state finals. And I think a lot of it just boiled down to a mental side of things. Both great wrestlers. Can't take anything away from those guys. They certainly achieved it, and we went back and forth prior to, but in my mind, I think mentally, I just wasn't prepared. There was no wrestling mindset back then, right? There was nothing to do, like sports psychology. There just wasn't the resources that we have today, 2023. So, really the only other highlights I had is, the Beast of the East back when I was wrestling. It had first started my sophomore year, but then it was called the Mid-Atlantic Wrestling Classic. And certainly there were some of the toughest schools in our area or on the East Coast, and Blair Academy and a lot of the prep schools and Jersey teams and things like that, but it's nowhere near what it is today. So, but I took second and fourth, and both of those years in the finals and my senior year, and then in the third place match my junior year, lost to a guy from Blair Academy, Nick Almeida. He ended up going and wrestling at Brown University. So, and then he won high school nationals. So no slouch. The guy was awesome. But I just remember his hand fighting in Blair Academy, just how tough they were. So that's kind of it. I started in seventh grade, went through high school. So after my senior year of losing the second year in the finals, I was just so done with the sport to an extent. That was my goal, to be a state champ. And I just always felt like if you were either a state champ or you were nothing, looking at the banners on the wall in our high school practice room. And there was plenty of banners for guys that were place finishers and that weren't state champs. But in my mind, or the way that we were kind of bred, it was, hey, you're either a state champ. That was your ultimate goal, to be a state champ. I don't want to say you were nothing, but ultimately our goal was to be a state champ in the St. Mark's Wrestling Room. And they had a lot of great teams over the years. But I didn't achieve that goal, right? But I was kind of past it at that point. I had met my wife, the summer before going into my senior year of high school. She already had a 2-year-old. Like I said, I had moved out 2 months before I graduated high school. So I was just kind of ready to move on with my life. So wanted nothing to do with wrestling for about, a year-ish. But my wife now, her stepfather was a wrestling coach, a youth wrestling coach. So at a certain point in time throughout that year, he just asked me if I'd be willing to help him out. And I was like, yeah, I guess, sure, no problem. So ultimately, when I was 19 years old, just a year out of high school, I started coaching, and really I was still full of piss and vinegar, and was a competitor, and just, wanted to win. And, I probably should have been competing in college somewhere, whether it was wrestling or any sport, but, I was a young coach. And so I started coaching at 19 years old, and it was at a school, St. Elizabeth School in Wilmington, Delaware. And it was the CYO program that they had back then. But I was gung ho, I was running it like today's version of travel teams. And even though it was a local league, we were going to Ohio Tournament of Champions. We had kids going to Tulsa Nationals. We were doing all those types of things. Practicing 3 days a week, finding a way. You're only allowed to practice 2 days a week, because 2 school nights. So, we were creative. Hey, Friday night, that's not a school night. So we were practicing on Friday nights. Then 5 years later, after coaching the St. Elizabeth CYO, and my father-in-law had, he ended up stepping down, and I took over. I was the head coach. But it was a volunteer position, we just did it because we loved it. But 5 years into that, I just, there were so many kids that we were coaching outside of our program in the off season because their programs would close down, right? So really they were our competitors. They were the other schools down the road or in the area. But in the fall and in the spring, those guys would come work out with us because we were working out. We started doing fall workouts, or we were training for Mile Wiles or Ohio Tournament of Champions. So, back then we would do fall, winter, spring. So I'd have these guys in the fall and the spring, and I was like, I want to coach them all the time. I want to develop these guys all the time, not just, when in the off season, along with some other things. So we just had some much higher goals and expectations of where we wanted to be. So back then there was really no wrestling clubs. It was just like school teams and rec teams. But there was one guy, Delaware's only national champion ever in college, Sheldon Thomas. He had the Thomas Wrestling Academy, and conversations with my wife and some other people, we decided, let's just start our own wrestling club. So in 2002, we started the Tyrant Wrestling Club. and we went out on our own, and we had an opportunity to work with everybody, whether they were wrestling for another school team or not. They could come train with us and as an extra practice, or some kids chose to come to us full time, whatever it may have been. But I had an opportunity to work or coach with a lot more guys. And a funny note on that is, originally we were like, hey, what's the name of our wrestling club going to be? And at first, the first time we ever went up to the Penn State tournament in the spring, the one that's at the end of February, beginning of March, we didn't really have a name yet, and we didn't really have like a full-fledged club yet. So we were the Delaware Elite Wrestling or something, Delaware Elite something or other. I don't even remember, but it was like a full sentence long, and I was just like, I want something catchy like Renegades, Foxcatcher, like those were household names, on the East Coast. Really nationwide, probably for that matter, but certainly like in the Pennsylvania area. And I'm like, man, that's just got a ring to it. But unless you say something 1,000 times, it never really sounds like it belongs, right? So I remember sitting in my youngest son CJ's bedroom, just playing with him, hanging out or whatever. I had bought his first pair of wrestling shoes that were way too big for him when he was like, I don't know, 6 months old, a year old, at the Ohio Tournament of Champions. And they were a pair of Adidas wrestling shoes. So I'm looking at them, and the tag had Tyrant. They were Tyrant Junior Adidas wrestling shoes. Now, it was spelled differently, right? But I looked at it, I'm like, man, you know what? I like that name. So that's really how we got our name, Tyrant Wrestling Club, back in the day. Was I just saw it on a pair of shoes. I'm like, that sounds pretty catchy. Let's go with Tyrant. So that's what we did. And, I started Tyrant Wrestling Club back in 2002. And I coached till about 2017. And then over the past 5 years or so, we had some changes in our business and some other things that I had stepped down from coaching high school. And then a year later, I stepped down from coaching our own club. And then actually this past March, a couple months ago, we decided just to close down the wrestling club in general. We had some other coaches that were running it for a couple years. One, my oldest son, Mike Malk, was in there coaching. A former teammate of mine and coach of the year at the high school level, and he was a national qualifier at Clarion. Stan Spoor, he was coaching it for a couple years. Then we had John Stoudemire jump in, who actually wrestled my oldest boy at youth tournaments when they were kids. And he's a great wrestler out of Pennsylvania. Went down to UNC, came back. He coached for a year. And then most recently, the new St. Mark's, head coach, Cam Butler, who was a state champ in Maryland, wrestled at Clarion. He ran it for a year. But we just decided, hey, it's been 20 years. It was a great run. Let's just go ahead and, just kind of end it here and go out on a high note. And, there's some other clubs in the area now. So, I'm confident that the kids will be able to get what they need, at least in our area of Northern Delaware. Throughout that time frame, I coached in high school at different times, but I coached St. Mark's. I was an assistant there with those guys off and on for years. And then for about 4 years, I was the head coach at Sanford School, which is a prep school. It's a day school. It wasn't a boarding school, but it was a very small private school. And I was there from 2012 to 2016. When I was in the heyday of coaching our wrestling club, we started getting into freestyle Greco as well in the off season. So I was the Team Delaware national teams coach from 2007 to 2011. And I really didn't know much about things, but I knew that we were selling, USA cards to our members at the club. So I ended up becoming the state chairman for Delaware USA Wrestling as well, in addition to coaching and doing all those things. So it's kind of where we're at with that. If I'm looking at our wrestling tournaments, during my coaching career, we originally started Tyrant Duels in 2002, the first year that I started my wrestling club. The only reason I really had this tournament was, well, number one, when we were at St. Elizabeth's, when I was coaching the school team, my father-in-law used to run a tournament once a year, and it was like an 8-team duels in a very small gym. I think we had 3 mats that we could fit in there, and we had teams like Council Rock and, but some other local teams, but that were tough, right? But they would come in and they would do it. So then I had the idea planning in my head from when I was coaching the school team that when I started Tyrant, I'm like, let me start Tyrant Duels. So, we started with 8 teams back in 2002, and then now we've grown in upwards of, 40 to 50 teams over the 20-year span. But really the whole reason why we did it was one less weekend to travel. We could pick whatever teams we wanted to wrestle. Back then, I would change the weight classes every single year based off the kids that I had in my room. And sometimes it would go in like 3-pound increments and 4-pound increments. But we didn't have a whole lot of guys sitting on the bench because I would just create the weight classes and I just wanted everybody to wrestle to get better. Well, then, like in the very beginning, our Tyrant Wrestling Club was, a lot of younger kids. But then the kids started getting older, and then eventually they went on to high school, right? This was a youth program back then, 8th grade and under. So all these guys started getting older. So eventually I'm like, and my oldest son, I'm like, you know what? So we added on to high school, and we were coaching high school guys. So that's how Columbus Day Duels actually came about too, is a lot of our guys that were in my club, we wanted to get them ready for the regular season. So we started the Columbus Day Duels in 2008 at St. Mark's High School. So we had 16 teams back then, and we wrestled in the gym. We were up in the cafeteria. We were down in the wrestling room. It's kind of like that old school tournament. You just show up on the weekends and you use as much square footage of the facility that you could, right? But like we didn't know any better. But like when I was running these tournaments, we were on paper back then. There was no track wrestling. There was no live stream. And I just had paper bout sheets, and I would hand them out, and I would just sit there and coach the whole time. And then when the guys were done running their dual meets were over, they would come over, hand me their bout sheet. I would fill out the bracket with a pencil, and then I would tell them what mat they're on next, and I'd go back to coaching. So, again, it was more about the coaching and the opportunities for our guys as opposed to like just being a full-fledged tournament director. So, again, we had that existing tournament at St. Elizabeth's. It was one less weekend to travel. I was able to control all the competition. And then, like I said, when we implemented Columbus Day Duels, it was just to get our high school guys ready for the season. So, once I stopped coaching about 5 years ago and I put all my effort into running tournaments, we basically have grown from 2 tournaments to about 20 tournaments in the past 3 to 4 years, or 3 to 5 years, let's say. And, so now it's like we're focused on the tournament side of things, and, there's no more coaching. So our days every day are invested into growing these tournaments and trying to provide as many opportunities as possible. And we've run tournaments in Delaware, Florida, Maryland, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia. We've been in Georgia and South Carolina. So, we're definitely up and down the East Coast. And there's some other states that we have our eyes on, and we're looking to run some tournaments in. It's just got to make sense for us at this point in time. We don't want to add another tournament just for sake of doing it. Another business that we had to kind of spun off from the wrestling, more so when I was coaching, but we started a sportswear company, so Tyrant SportsGear. And I didn't really know what I wanted to call it, but I wanted it to be different. And like, well, we're going to have sportswear, like apparel, but I'm also selling gear and equipment and things like that. So we decided to call it SportsGear, and it's constantly correcting people in the spelling of that name. But that was established in 2014. In the very beginning, I was really just selling wrestling supplies. And my first account ever was with Tom Scully from Adidas Wrestling. So shout out to Tom. He's been awesome all along. And, he was willing to open us up. And that was just, back then, you didn't know what you didn't know. And it was just cool for him to, I don't know, open me up, take a chance on me, do whatever. And there was only like an hour up the road. He wrestled at Lehigh. He's a former teammate or, alum with my coach, my high school coach. So there were some things that were in common, but, I'll never forget he was the guy that gave me my first account as a sportswear company. And really in the very beginning, it was just to save money. I was spending all this money on buying apparel for the wrestling club and the camps that we were running and all those things. And so I was just trying to save money. So I opened up my own accounts to get things at a wholesale price. Then one thing kind of led to another, hey, where'd you get that from? Well, we made it or we did it. So now, we sell wrestling supplies. We have apparel, and we do any sports teams. We have promotional products. We got sports teams. We have schools. We have businesses. We do everything. But again, it just kind of spun off from the wrestling side of things, and now we got a full-fledged apparel and promotions company, which is pretty cool. One thing I really don't talk a whole lot about when we're in these environments is, I've always had a passion for real estate, and we also, own another company called CJF Group, which is, a real estate investment company and, basically rental properties and things like that. So, but I remember, first starting back in like 2005, and I bought my first house when I was 19 years old, actually. So I rented a townhouse for a year when I first moved out of high school. And then my wife and I bought a house. I was 19 years old and she was 22. But we bought our first house. It was only $100,000. And then, the market went up so fast. And, instead of, throwing your money away on rent. I had all this equity, and I'm like, man, if I bought another house like this and it appreciates as much as the house that I have now, man, I'd have all this money. So, a combination of things though was, one, we had some bad tenants. Two, what I found out is I had 3 young kids and I was always busy with them and I was just too busy to manage them. It didn't help that the market crashed. And then really like in 2009, we decided to sell the few properties that we had and just kind of cut our losses and move on, and thought we'd never get into it again. At least my wife didn't want to ever get into it again. But for a bunch of different reasons, in 2018, so about 4 years ago, we decided to kind of jump back into it. And so since then, we've been adding to our portfolio as fast as we strategically can. And again, it's okay to make mistakes as long as you learn from it, right? So like I know what happened the first go around back in 15 years ago, and I wouldn't be making those. I hope not to make those same mistakes now, right? Like I learned a lesson and just different things, and to be a little bit more patient. Or like my one uncle says, sometimes the best deal is no deal, right? Or patience, just different things like that. So anyway, I love real estate, and I love investing into those things, and you start to get creative. So that's another passion of ours, and that's really why I'm involved in it. Is I'm just passionate about providing housing opportunities to those that can't afford a home, or somebody that's temporarily in the area that needs to be able to rent, or just whatever it may be. Another thing that we've really kind of done is the philanthropy side of things, and really areas that are important to me, my family, our business. Some areas where we either donate our time or we donate some financial resources. But one is Alzheimer's, and my grandmother had passed away from Alzheimer's, and then my wife's grandmother passed away from Alzheimer's, / dementia. So that's something that's always been important to me, and quite honestly, it probably runs in the family. So, but we try to help out where we can with Alzheimer's, with different organizations. Another one is breast cancer. My mother, thank God she's a survivor of breast cancer, but it's been probably about 23 years and change, because I remember her coming over to my first house and just breaking the news to me that she just got diagnosed with breast cancer. And when you hear cancer, I think a lot of times you just, you think that they're not going to make it, they're going to pass away eventually, or, it's terminal. And certainly there's some people that don't make it. And there are some people that are fortunate enough to make it. But originally, the reason why we were interested in, breast cancer and breast cancer awareness and just different things that we do with that is because of my mother. But I've had teammates where they've lost their mothers. I know other people that have had breast cancer. Right now, my sister-in-law, she's been battling through breast cancer. My high school coach's wife had it. I mean, there's just, everybody knows somebody that had breast cancer, right? So if there's a way that we can help them, if there's a way that we can bring awareness, if there's a way that we can eventually hopefully find a cure, those are why we do the things that we do. The next one would be Parkinson's. And the biggest reason why, we're interested in Parkinson's is my middle school coach that got me involved. He was my middle school art teacher, my middle school wrestling coach. He's the one that got me involved in the sport of wrestling. And, Mr. Martz. And, he's recently passed away. He was involved with the Michael J. Fox Foundation. He was involved with a lot of different organizations. But certainly I know the Michael J. Fox Foundation was one of the ones where he spoke extremely high of, and he had some level of involvement out of New York, although he lived in Delaware. But and then I got reunited with my middle school coach years after. It was probably about 5 years ago. I saw him at a breakfast at Sanford School. It was a fundraiser. It was called Pancakes for Parkinson's. And I saw him there, and I just said, hey, so we started going to lunch. We started talking on the phone. We started doing things, when you're a kid and you're in school, especially when you're younger, but it could be high school, middle school, elementary school, but you think you know it all. Kind of a young punk school, kid that's, just not always respectful, just whatever. I mean, there's some kids that are overly respectful, right? But for me, it was just like, I just went in there, had a chip on my shoulder every day. Sure as heck didn't want to go to art class. And then there was times where he was pissing me off, let's say at middle school practice, right? So when I left Tower Hill and then I went to St. Mark's, I don't know that I ever had another conversation with Mr. Marks, my middle school wrestling coach. But fast forward, 20, 25 years later, seeing him and just then having an opportunity to spend time with him and get to know him better and just talk about things. And, with me losing my father at such a young age, there was different people in my life that started to fill that void a little bit. And I just really enjoyed spending time with him and talking to him. And, I had the opportunity to at least thank him and show some gratitude and tell him how much I appreciated him, when I was in middle school. I'm looking back on it. And then now in our relationship. And, it's really upsetting that he's gone. But I know that he's in a better place, just like, anybody that has a disease. So, another person that's near and dear to my heart is, my Uncle Wayne. He's in a very bad stage of Parkinson's at this point. And I had no brothers and sisters, right? But my one cousin, Todd, was like my brother. And we used to spend a ton of time together. And he was one of my biggest supporters, a couple years older than me, came to all my wrestling matches, came to my state tournament, but it's his stepfather. So I spent a lot of time around him. And, he was a farmer and, who knows why he got what he got. But I just know right now he's kind of in, that end stage of Parkinson's. So those three, Alzheimer's, breast cancer, and Parkinson's are organizations that we don't talk a ton about at our wrestling tournaments. But we certainly do when it's, in the month of, Alzheimer's, recognition month, and breast cancer, in October, and then Parkinson's. So the one you do hear us talk about at our wrestling tournaments most of the times, if not all the times, I guess it's been about a year and a half. And, we started talking about it, mental health and suicide prevention about a year and a half ago at our tournaments. And then it just had such a big impact. And there were so many people coming up and talking to us, and it just got crazy. And then COVID hit, right? So like all these things were happening, and we're like, you know what? We need to talk about this all the time. So certainly have asked ourselves, do we want to talk about it at every tournament? Is it a buzzkill, where people are getting pumped up to wrestle? But when we're going to be adding, like a vendor booth, we're going to be adding an info booth at our tournaments. We had one at Poseidon down in Florida recently, back in April. But our goal is to bring in people that have lost a loved one. Our goal is to bring in counselors or professors or anybody that can be there to talk to people and let them know that they're not the only one that struggles. Don't be afraid to talk about it. So the mental health and suicide prevention is something that we're heavily involved with. But the reason why I started is, a little over 23 years ago, my father-in-law took his life. And, it rocked our family. And certainly has changed us forever. And, I had just lost my grandfather, who was like my dad, because it was my dad's dad, and I didn't have my dad. So I got really close to my grandfather. I had just lost him. And I remember sitting in the first house that I bought, and I was only around 21 years old. And the hospice people came out, and the only reason I even met with the Delaware hospice people is because my grandfather did some work with them. And I'm like, okay, fine. They wanted to come out and make sure we were okay or just talk to us. And I just remember telling them that, hey, look, I'm so used to losing people that it doesn't even faze me to a point anymore. And, yeah, I'm upset, but like, I'm okay, right? Like, I'm okay. Like, I don't need any help. Right after this person from the hospice had left, we got a phone call, and I don't even know if we had cell phones back then, but certainly our landline had rung, and a family member told us something had happened, and we were just like, okay, well, what hospital is he in? Is he okay? And come to find out, he took his life, and he was such a great man, and in my eyes, he was almost perfect enough to the point where if somebody was going to, fill in for my dad, it would have been him. And it was just shocking. And we've never dealt with anybody taking their life before. So it was different. And, we went to some suicide, grieving, meetings, and there's not much around. So initially we lost my father-in-law, again, like 23 years ago. And then, my daughter lost one of her best guy friends. He was a college baseball player. She went to high school with him, but he was a college baseball player. And then I lost a couple wrestlers, guys that were 19 years old, freshmen in college, another guy that was 30 years old. And it was just something where I was like, you know what, we need to do something to try to make a difference here. And we started back up the support groups. Another friend of mine who's a coach in Delaware, he lost his son at a very young age. So it just continues to happen. And so throughout talking about this at our tournaments, originally it was really targeted and geared towards all the, athletes, like the wrestlers, like high school guys, really probably more so. Well, then, there was 12-year-olds and 10-year-olds taking their life. So we're like, okay, we got to, gear this towards, all the athletes that are here. And then there was people coming up to me and talking to me that were former vets, or a parent that lost their job through COVID, or somebody that just struggled with mental illness, whatever it may be. But so then we're like, well, shit, man, the audience is just getting broader and broader and broader. In fact, the matter is, there's a lot of people that struggle with mental illness. There's a lot of people that have depression and anxiety. And, I think, yeah, a lot of people could say that they have that, but there's some people where it's truly an illness. And then there's just some people that just don't know how to deal with it, right? So they have something, they don't know how to deal with adversity. And it's the first time they've ever had something in their life that was, shocking to them, or a loss of a loved one, or a breakup with a girl, or a bad grade, or didn't get into the college they wanted to, or whatever it may be. But so that's kind of why we do what we do. So we started a support group with a local organization. They've since have kind of taken full control over that, but they started it. They didn't have it at the time. But locally, we joined up with Unlock the Light, and Chris Locke, he lost his son. He was about 25, 26 years old, but he was in his mid to late 20s. And it was a surprise. It was a shock. Nobody saw anything that would have led him to believe that, that he was ill. And so in addition to all the things that they do through Unlock the Light, they also, Chris purchased his son's frat house on the University of Delaware campus, and turned that into a house where, from age, I think it's 14 to 24, but primarily was for the college kids on campus, but anybody can stop by. But if you're struggling, if you have thoughts of killing yourself, if you need help, if anything's wrong, you can walk into that house 24 hours a day. And quite honestly, it's something that we need to find a way to get on every college campus across the country, or, one in every state or in big cities, because it's made a difference. And it's only been open a little over a year or so. And I forget the stats, but they've had thousands of people come in there. And they got licensed professionals in there, and counselors and people, and at least somebody to talk to right away when it happens. And then they'll get people professional help, or help them with, if they don't have insurance or whatever it may be. But, those are the 4 areas that we are kind of near and dear to our heart. And but the one that I know most of you guys hear us talk about most of the time is mental health and suicide prevention. And we can't stop. And I always just kind of say to some people that probably feel bored in the crowd, is that, hey, by you listening to us for 5 or 10 minutes, even though you may not have any issues whatsoever, you just invested into saving somebody else's life. Because I can tell you there's at least one person, if not a slew more, that struggle, that are at these wrestling tournaments that we run, where there's thousands of people. We have such a big audience of people that we can speak to and hopefully make a difference. So that's kind of where we're at with that. Family-wise, because that's really the most important. I guess you save the most important for last. But family-wise, I met my wife in 1995. It was the summer. It was her sister's senior week in Dewey Beach, Delaware. So if you're a local, or if you've ever traveled to Delaware, but this place called Dewey Beach in Delaware, I had met Christine at her sister's senior week, and they already kind of knew who I was because her stepfather was coaching wrestling. And then the guy that I lost to in my junior year of high school from St. Elizabeth, who's a good friend of mine now, Darren Kelly, it was their only state champ ever. And so their only state champ ever beat me in the finals. And then to kind of twist the knife, that's where I ended up coaching the school team before I started Tyrant. So when I would walk into the gym at St. Elizabeth's, they had a life-size sign, or it wasn't a banner, it was like a hard banner sign in the lobby, like where the trophy cases go, of their state champion. So every day that I went to practice or a match, I had to look at the guy that beat me. And then on top of that, every once in a while, somebody would just throw it in my face, who's the state champ or whatever, but it's all good. But that's how I met my wife. At the time, she had a 2-year-old. She's a little bit older than me, right? So she was already out of high school, but she had a 2-year-old, Michael. And tell you how small the world is, it's crazy because his father played baseball at the same organization that I played in. He was a little bit older than me, but he played at the same organization that I played in, Manor Gardens in Newcastle, that the funeral director got me involved with. So like when she was telling me like, oh, the father of my son, and I was like, oh, no way, I know him and his family. And I played on the same team as his cousin and just some other things. So it was just a small world. Fast forward to where we're at today, Michael's 30 years old, and he works full-time with me at Tyrant. We have a daughter together, Mackenzie. She's 26. When I was 19, that's when she was born. And now she's got a 1-year-old. Actually, today he turns 16 months old. And, Nolan, fun fact, she named him Nolan James. So first name Nolan, that's after my father. His middle name is James. That's after my wife's father. So that was just, it made us feel, I think we cried when we heard that she wanted to do that. It was such an honor. And it meant so much to us. She went away and became a registered nurse. She's still a part-time nurse, but she actually works for Tyrant now full-time. And then our youngest son, CJ, he's now 23 years old. I had him when I was 22 years old, and really my wife had him, but I was 22 years old when he was born, and he works full-time for Tyrant now, but really his love and passion is producing and DJing techno music. So I don't know, potentially if you're in the Philadelphia, New York area, or if you listen to techno music online, you might already know who he is. But I'm proud to say that, we're a family business. So whether it's Tyrant Wrestling, Tyrant SportsGear, whatever we have going on, but you certainly know my kids and my wife from being at my wrestling tournaments. My wife, Christine, a lot of times she's at the head table or she's working the box office where the admissions are. My son, Mike, is the one that's running around fixing all the score clock and computer problems. Mackenzie, she's always at the head table. She's dealing with just anything and everything that's out there. And then my youngest boy, CJ, sometimes he's kind of in the background, but tall, and he's the one that's all tatted up. So you certainly have seen some of these guys. Trying to wrap this up, didn't know how long it was going to take, but here's our vision. Here's my vision for this podcast. So, it's called the Tyrant Network. And there's a couple of different reasons why. One, I think wrestling has allowed me to build a network over the years of relationships with people on and off the mat. And, when you hear network too, you also think about like a TV or broadcasting, radio, things like that. So this is, going to be on all of our social media channels. But, so we have this video or podcast or whatever you want to call it. But, we decided to go with the Tyrant Network. So I've thought about doing this for at least, 2-3 years. And some of it's time. And then some of it was like, well, why me? Well, why me? What makes me so special? And what makes me, I think there's so many other people that are more interesting or more experienced or better spoken, certainly better looking, I can tell you that. But there was like a defining moment where I just said, you know what? Instead of saying why me, the better question is why not me, right? So I want to share any experience and knowledge that I certainly have gathered over, my lifetime. And then more so, I look forward to having, once we get through this first episode where it was all about me and it was just so people understood who this guy was, I'm going to have on some very interesting, guests I can't wait to interview, and we already have them lined up. So that was really it. Why not me, right? So here we are today. After 20 years of coaching and running tournaments and working for a Fortune 200 company, I've started multiple companies. I want to share as much information as possible. More so, I've met so many people along the way that have a wealth of knowledge that I just think I could benefit from it. And I think any of our listeners could benefit from it. So, for some odd reason, nobody subscribes and nobody listens. I can't wait. I'm excited to meet and talk to and interview and just have a conversation that's on tape with some people that I know that are out there that are part of this big network that we've created through wrestling. So that's kind of like the plan, for the future episodes. Some of it's going to be related to wrestling, obviously, because that's most of what I do. But then some of it's not going to be related to wrestling. Again, the knowledge, the experience, the different things. But I mean, they don't even teach personal finance in school half the time. People don't know what FICO scores are. They don't know how to establish credit. Whatever it may be, there's just so much out there that I think people could benefit from. So if you can help us grow this podcast, and then everything else that we're doing, and we're working on it now. Again, everything that we've done, we've learned on our own, and it's not like when I worked at a company that, you had human resources department, you had security, you had your technical support, you had all these different departments. At any time you had a question, you could just call down to somebody and you had an expert. Well, when you own your own business, you don't have any support from anybody. Everything, or at least internally, so everything you do, it costs you time and it costs you money. Well, now I'm at a point in my career where we do have some resources, and we do have a network of people. And, what you find out is some of the people that aren't as successful don't want to share any information at all. And they keep it real close, to their chest. And they feel like they're going to give away a secret. But some of the other people, that I've gotten to know in, the apparel industry, the sportswear industry, some people in the wrestling industry, and then certainly in real estate, and then especially people outside of the three, industries that I'm involved with. Some of the most successful people are the biggest open books out there, and really all you got to do is ask. And a lot of times, if you have a similar interest, or you just strike up a conversation, or maybe they wrestled 20 years ago, but a lot of times these guys want to share information. They want to talk about how they got to where they're at now, and it's pretty cool. So if you take advantage of those things, you can really fast track yourself. No matter what areas of life you're interested in, you could avoid making the same mistakes that they made. You could avoid wasting money that they spent on trying different things and all those types of things. So, those are the people I can't wait to have on our podcast. So, but if you can follow us, like us, share, whatever it may be, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and then subscribe to our YouTube channel. Right now, our most popular ones are under Tyrant Wrestling. We do have Tyrant SportsGear that needs a little bit of work. And then, eventually maybe we'll have something specific for the podcast. But for right now, everything's basically going to be through our website and all our social media sites of Tyrant Wrestling. So if you guys could follow, like, share, do those types of things. Anybody that took 48 minutes out of their life today to decide to listen to me talk, thank you. But hopefully, like I said, going forward, the plan is to go 20 to 30 minutes, something that's short and sweet, and, you'd be looking forward to listening to. So really appreciate you guys listening today. I appreciate all your support at our tournaments. I appreciate all your support for those that, get their apparel and uniforms and sporting goods from us. And we look forward to working with you guys and, bringing on some great guests and just sharing life with you. So hit us up, tag us, like us, all those great things. And we'll talk to you soon. So there's the first episode of the Tyrant Network. Boom, we finally got it done.